As a pastor, one of the most interesting or maybe the strangest things about being a pastor is that you get invited into people's best and worst moments. Now, there's a lot of space in the middle that people don't invite pastors in, because it's weird to have the pastor over for dinner or whatever. But you get invited to the very best days and the very worst days. I've had opportunities to sit down with people who have brought in large sums of money that they just wanted to put to good kingdom use. And those are fun days, right? When you have been blessed and you have opportunity to come alongside and to do something significant, to hand over a six-figure check. I have no idea what that is like, but I can imagine it's got to be fun. Right? That has to be a fun day to say, hey, I just want to help, accomplish this large task or help people in our community or whatever that might be. But while I get invited into those spaces, I also have sat with people who are just at the end of their ability to keep up with life, and they're begging for help just to keep from losing their homes. Those are terrible days. Those are difficult days. And those conversations come after lots of difficult days, right? They don't just happen. They come after a season that's really, really hard. Just last week, we had the opportunity to participate in baby and child dedications. Just in the last, 2 weeks, we've had the chance to come alongside families that have welcomed new life into the world, and those are really fun, beautiful days, aren't they? I got a phone call or a text this morning from one of my closest friends from the very first church we served up in Brooklyn, that his dad just passed away overnight, and it's time to make funeral arrangements. Those are difficult days. So we celebrate and we mourn with different people. Last week, I had a really great meeting with a young couple who's getting married this summer. And they're excited about life, and they have all kinds of hopes and dreams and expectations, and they're planning a beautiful weekend together with their closest family and friends, and we're going to celebrate as they share covenant vows together in marriage. There's all kinds of excitement, right? There's all kinds of fun conversation to have with that couple. I've also sat from time to time with couples who just can't see a way forward any longer. They cannot figure out ways to come together and find common ground as husband and wife. They have come to the place where they would say, as you hear often, we have irreconcilable differences. We have problems that just can't be fixed. And they're ready to walk away. We've been talking through this series, Mr. and Mrs. Right, to try to strengthen and grow our marriages in such a way that we don't come to that moment. We don't come to that point. What is the purpose of marriage? Who might I look for to partner with? Who would be the right person? How do I engage on a daily basis with my spouse? What are the right practices for marriage? Today we want to finish up by talking about some ways that we can protect that most sacred of relationships. Fortunately, we have instructions, we have warnings to look out for. The scriptures offer us in Proverbs 5, 6, and 7 all kinds of instructions. And it's beautiful, poetic literature. And so if you are one who is kind of a visual learner and visual thinker, as we read through Proverbs 5, 6, and 7, you can see these things kind of play out. Perhaps you've seen them play out in real life with friends or neighbors. So today we're going to be looking largely at these 3 chapters to examine the instructions that Solomon gives to his sons about marriage. How do we protect this marriage relationship so that we don't get to a point 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 40 years down the road where we say, what is broken cannot be fixed? Now, you will notice in the language of chapters 5, 6, and 7 of the book of Proverbs that Solomon is addressing the adulterous woman with his sons. Solomon is giving these instructions to his boys, so he's warning them about some fictitious adulterous woman that could serve as a threat to their marriages. But for our conversation this morning, I would argue that we can flip the script, right? These are also instructions to our daughters or to wives about the adulterous man. I would even argue that I think we can expand the principles that we read about here in Proverbs 5, 6, and 7 to have nothing to do with adultery, to also include really any other threat that might come against our marriages. I know that it is written specifically about a person that might come in and try to step between you and your spouse. But there are all kinds of things that come between us and our husbands and wives. And Solomon gives instructions about what to do within that relationship to protect it against said threats. So let's look at it together this morning. He says in chapter 5 to his sons, verses 7 to 8, "Now then, my sons, listen to me. Do not turn aside from what I say. Keep to a path far from her," speaking of this adulterous woman, "and do not go near the door of her house." Now, Solomon's warning to them is clear and concise, and it's one that is not to be taken lightly. He repeats himself several times, making his point strongly. "Listen to me. Don't turn aside from what I say. Don't veer away from my instructions to you that I'm about to give you in any way. Keep a path far away, and don't go near the door of her house." Create narrow boundaries for your relationship with your wives, he's saying to his boys. And he gives these instructions to be very wary of all of these things because Solomon understands how easily small threats kind of creep their way into your lives. Big threats are easy, right? Obvious threats to your marriage are easy to avoid. We see them coming. They are not sneaky. They kind of show their face early. And it's fairly simple for us to see a threat and to avoid it, to run away from it, to defend against it. What happens most often, however, is that these threats are not so obvious. It's not a flirtatious coworker. It's not somebody at the gym who starts calling you and reaching out to you on social media on a regular basis. Those are obvious threats. When somebody who's not your spouse begins to seek attention and time from you, those are threats that are obvious. Those are threats that are clear, usually not just to the individual being approached, but also to their spouse. But what about more subtle threats to our marriages? What about the 2 hours on social media scrolling in the evening instead of having conversation with your wife? What about a simple, subtle threat, like being gone 4 or 5 nights a week, running your kids to sports and to other activities, so that you're not sharing meals together? You're at work all day. You used to eat dinner together when the kids were young, but you can't remember the last time you sat down as a family to share a meal. What about subtle threats like the fact that you haven't had an uninterrupted conversation in the car for the past 4 months because the little ones are constantly needing something or wanting to tell a story? You know, that's not even a bad thing coming from the back seat, the fact that your children want your attention, but it can serve as a threat to your marriage if you're not careful. Not all threats are bad things. Some good things can actually threaten the relationship we have with our husbands or wives. Solomon tells his son here in Proverbs 5, keep a path far from her. Do not go near the door of her house. What Solomon is saying to his sons is, you need to be mindful and wary of the things that don't seem to be threatening to your marriage. The neighbor lady probably isn't showing up at your door with a pizza half-dressed. Not the first time. Right? It's a lot more subtle than that. And Solomon say, boys, you better pay attention, and you better be mindful of what's happening around you, or you end up on social media night after night, not having conversation with the most important person in your life, even though you're sitting right next to them on the couch. You better be wary of the dangers of the person who's paying a little more attention to you at the office. Because it's the beginning that we don't notice. It's not the end. The end disaster is painfully obvious to everybody in your family and probably most of your friends. But it's those beginning steps that we leave go because we don't recognize what's happening. And Solomon says, sons, be mindful and wary. Don't go anywhere near this stuff. Don't veer from the instructions I'm about to give you. Don't wander a step. Stay on the sidewalk. Do not cross over the street because you saw something that drew your attention that way. Also, in this whole section, toward the end in chapter 7, he says to his sons, at the window of my house, I looked down through the lattice. I saw among the simple. I noticed among the young men. That's a tough one. A youth who had no sense. We got plenty of those, don't we? We have some middle-aged that have no sense too. I noticed among the young men a youth who had no sense. He was going down the street near her corner, walking along in the direction of her house at twilight as the day was fading, as the dark of night set in. Solomon sees trouble. He's watching, and the young men of his neighborhood are out on the streets. They're talking, they're hanging out, playing stickball, whatever's going on, right? Like, they're just being guys outside. And one of them is wandering away from the herd. And it's twilight, and he's headed toward a house that Solomon knows what happens in that place. And as he watches from his windows, he already knows trouble is brewing, and he thinks, this kid has no clue what he's walking into. If you jump down to verses 22 and 23, after he's described what takes place, he says, all at once he followed her like an ox going to the slaughter, like a deer stepping into a noose, till an arrow pierces her liver. This is Michigan. We got lots of hunters. What's the deal with a liver shot? What happens with a liver shot? It takes a while, doesn't it? It's not a quick death. It's a slow death, a liver shot. And Solomon sees what's happening, and he says, this poor kid, like a deer stepping into a noose, who's about to have his liver pierced, like a bird darting into a snare, little knowing it will cost him his life. He has no idea what trouble he's walking into, what danger he's flirting with. There is a sense that he's oblivious to what is coming down the road, and Solomon already sees it, and he writes to his sons, you have to pay attention. This deer stepping into the noose just feels like a snare, not a big deal. Probably doesn't even cause pain, at least not at the beginning. And then the pain, the prick of the arrow comes. And over time, what does it lead to? It leads to death. Solomon actually says that several times in these 3 chapters. That what happens when we don't pay attention to the small threats is that over time they take over They cause incredible damage and eventually lead to death. And it makes sense that Solomon, seeing this ahead of time, would so fervently warn his sons against it. Because we take care of the things we love and that we care about, don't we? Think about how closely you watch the things that you love. When your children are little, 5, 6, 7 years old, and you take them to one of the stores, how closely do you watch them when they're not in the cart? Constantly, it takes 3 seconds for them to disappear under one of those racks of clothes. And then panic ensues. How long before you start feeling uncomfortable? Not very long, is it? Years ago, we had a bunch of friends over. I was just talking about this with them yesterday. Years ago, we had friends over for a birthday party, and the men, there were three of us guys, we left our apartment to go pick up pizza. It was literally a mile down the road. We left the apartment. Kids are all playing, running around in the apartment. We left. We went and picked up the pizza. We came back, and there was sheer panic and pandemonium in the apartment. All of our wives were looking, feverishly for Lainey, our middle child. And we're like, well, when was the last time we saw her? How long has she been gone? And the best we could figure is none of the adults had made notice of her in like 45 minutes. The kids had been playing. Nobody was in or out. She was very young. She was probably 5 years old. We didn't think she could probably get out the door, but didn't know if maybe we hadn't latched the door on our way out. We were in full panic mode. Turns out she'd been playing hide and seek with all the kids. She climbed into the toy box and fell asleep. She was fine. She was having a little nap before dinner. But 40 minutes later, as we're calling for her and she's sound asleep amidst all the stuffed animals in the toy box, she doesn't hear us. We're mindful of those things that we care about. We'd been gone just a few moments. We lock our cars overnight in our own driveways. We keep our valuables within eyesight at the beach. We watch carefully as our kids frolic in the waves. We take extra precautions. When I travel abroad, if I'm on a mission trip or if we go to the Middle East, to the Holy Lands, when I travel, I pull my wallet out of my back pocket. I take all my credit cards, important cards, I stick them in my front pocket, and I put my wallet back where it belongs. And if somebody takes it, they don't get anything of value. Costco membership card, whoop-de-doo, right? So we take care of the things that we value. We watch over them closely. Do we keep the same wary approach? Are we as mindful about the relationship with our husbands or wives as we are about all these other things? Are we paying attention to the possible threats? Are we building barriers and guardrails against those threats that might come for our marriages? Proverbs 7, verses 25 to 26. Do not let your heart turn to her ways or stray into her paths. Many are the victims she's brought down. Her slain are a mighty throng. This first expression in 2 lines, don't let your heart turn to her ways or stray into her paths. Both the word turn and stray indicate a mindless or oblivious veering off of a moral path. You're not even willingly running into trouble. It's just not being aware of the subtle intentions or the growing intentions of another. We need to be protecting our marriages by being aware, being cautious of those things that can distract us from our husbands or our wives. And those distractions come in all different forms. Busy schedules, heavy workloads, bad habits, addictions, individuals who show inappropriate interest, those things that first distract us and only distract us eventually will serve to divide us from our husbands and wives. If we don't pay attention to them now, if we're not at least aware of them and cautious with them, they grow over time and become real problems. At the very beginning of this section of Scripture, in the opening verses of chapter 5, verses 3 and 4, Solomon says, "For the lips of the adulterous woman, they drip with honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. But in the end, she is bitter as gall, sharp as any double-edged sword." It seems pleasant, maybe even good at the beginning, and over time, if we're not cautious, it becomes devastating to us. In premarital counseling sessions, I tell young couples, left unattended, what is first only caustic becomes catastrophic. That which only serves as a small annoyance becomes devastatingly painful over time if not addressed. Think about rust on your car. Buy a brand new car and you just catch a stone as you're driving down the road, just a little chip in the paint. Or maybe you drive down a dirt road in the winter and you pick up some of the dirt and the soil and the salt that's been put on the roads, and your tires kick it up underneath, and it just kind of sticks to the underbody of your car. And you don't even know it's there. You don't pay any attention to it. If you wash it off after a few days, no big deal. But if you don't address it, that which is caustic, that the moisture and the salt sitting against the metal of the frame of your car, over many weeks and months and year after year after year, what happens to Michigan cars? They eat away, don't they? Rust begins to form and grow what is just a little bit caustic, just some salt. It's not even a big deal, but over time, that which is caustic becomes catastrophic to your car. We have to be careful. We have to make notice of those things that distract us from what is supposed to be, meant to be, what you have promised to be the most important relationship to you in the whole world. It might seem okay at first, but Solomon says that her steps lead straight to the grave in verse 5. He tells us, as we already read in verse 8, that we should go nowhere near her door. What is he saying in short? Not only should we be aware and wary of potential dangers, but when we notice them, when we see these hazards to our relationship with our spouse, Solomon says, get the heck out of Dodge and run as fast as you can. Run, don't walk from trouble. Don't handle these inappropriate relationships absent-mindedly. Don't casually dismiss your spouse's need for conversation and requests for time spent with as you continue to scroll or mindlessly binge watch whatever show comes up next on TV. Don't be indecisive about relationships and decisions that divide you and your spouse. Avoid treating these things superficially and without their due seriousness. They are caustic. And over time, they continue to eat and erode and cut the legs out from under your marriages. Proverbs 6:28 and 29, can a man walk on hot coals without his feet being scorched? So is he who sleeps with another man's wife. No one who touches her will go unpunished. In verses 8 to 10 of chapter 5, again, keep a path far from her. Do not go near the door of her house, lest you lose your honor to others and your dignity to one who is cruel, lest strangers feast on your wealth and your toil enrich the house of another. Here we see Solomon has given his instructions to his sons. Stay far away from her door. Don't go anywhere near her house, because if you do, here's what you can expect. And he lays out these troubles, these consequences that come from continuing down this dangerous path. You'll lose honor and dignity with those around you. You don't even have to go inside the house. You just hang out near her home. Solomon's not the only one who knows who lives there, is he? Everybody in the neighborhood knows what happens on that property. And just hanging out down by the corner to be noticed, just traveling regularly near trouble, people begin to question your motives. People begin to question your dignity, your responsibility, your honor, your character. He says, don't go near the door of her house, lest you lose your honor to others and your dignity to one who is cruel. Man, how true is that in a social media-filled age where people love to post their opinions and fill in the blanks about other people's lives on social media? The first thing you probably will experience, if you're not protecting, if people don't know that you fight for your wife, if people aren't convinced and absolutely certain that you honor your husband and he is still the most important person to you, when behavior is questionable, they'll fill out the rest of the story for you, whether it's true or not. Lest strangers feast on your wealth and your toil enrich the house of another. There is incredible financial cost when a marriage falls apart. Everyone in the family suffers. It never gets easier when we split that which has been brought together. There are spiritual consequences listed in verses 11 and 14. When we engage in physical indulgences, whether it's an extramarital affair or it's our own selfish behaviors and interests that we have ignored our family for year after year after year, if we continually neglect our families for our own interests, that again is caustic to our relationships. Me first mentality. If I'm constantly chasing what I enjoy and ignoring what my family needs, specifically what my spouse needs from me, eventually these things become true. There are spiritual consequences, there are financial consequences, there are relational consequences with friends and neighbors. Chapter 6, verses 32 to 35 talk about other consequences. Solomon has no shortage of warnings against what happens when our marriages begin to fall apart. When these unintended or unattended threats continue on, they rarely go away on their own. Solomon talks elsewhere in the book Song of Songs about the little foxes. He says in chapter 2, verse 15, when talking about his relationship with his beloved Shulamith, he says, "Catch for us the little foxes that ruin the vineyards, our vineyards that are in full bloom." In the Middle East, there are these foxes they're smaller than the foxes we have here in the U.S. They're little larger than a squirrel. They're tiny little creatures. And they run around the vineyards. They're too small to be able to reach up and grab the fruit off of the vine. And so what they do is they chew away at the soft outer bark at the base of the vines. And these little foxes are so small that they don't even do devastating damage all the way up the vine. They just chew away a little bit, nibble away a little bit of the outer bark, and then they run along. And without closely examining the damage that they've done, you might not even notice it. But as these little foxes chew away just little pieces of that bark, what happens over time? Moisture gets in there, bugs get in there, mildew or mold can grow in there if the grass is grown up around the base of the vine, holding in that moisture. And over time, eventually, disease or insect take over and kill the vine. These, again, small threats, minor inconveniences, left unattended, over time chew away at our marriages. And so the question for us is to examine what in our lives is chewing away at the intimacy of your relationship with your spouse. What annoyance, what little problem, what distraction is causing damage to the foundation, to the root of your marriage? And are you willing to go to the trouble to run off those problems? Or will we tolerate them? Will we continue to allow them to eat away, eventually destroying the fruit of a healthy, vibrant marriage? What are you giving to? What are you accepting from someone else that should only be given to your spouse or should only be accepted from them? A look? Ongoing compliments? Those flirtatious gestures, touches, grazes, time that you give to maybe it's not even a romantic relationship. Maybe it's just time that you're willing to give your friends that you're unwilling to give your wife. Maybe it's attention that you are more than happy to give the children that your husband has been desperate for months, if not years. Are we tending to the little foxes? Are we allowing them to continue? Last advice that I want to look at today comes from verses 15 and 17 of chapter 5. I'll warn you, this is a euphemism. This is like going to see Shrek. Your kids won't get it, but you definitely will. Drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. Should your springs overflow in the streets, your streams of water in the public squares, let them be yours alone, never to be shared with strangers. Husbands and wives, there are certain things that you should only receive or offer to your spouse. Craig Groeschel one time said, if the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, it's time to water your own lawn. I love that. So we'll use that as our last piece of advice. Husbands and wives, you need to water your lawn. You need to give to your spouses what they desire and what they require of you. As Paul said, your body is not your own, and that's not just talking about physical intimacy. That's talking about attention. That's talking about effort. That's talking about what you give to your spouse. If my neighbor's lawn is great and mine is not, and this is the case, can I just tell you, Jack and Diane Bowles have the most amazing lawn. This summer, find out where they live. Just drive by. They're on a cul-de-sac. It's the most exquisite lawn. The lines are perfectly straight. They're dark and light, alternating back and forth. The landscaping is exquisite. Fresh wood chips in the spring. Like, they have an amazing lawn. Mine less so. And you'll see that as you drive down, because we live close to them. My kids have been driving through the yard all winter when they get parked in. So now there's like ruts. Like, it's bad, right? So you'll see this play out this spring for sure. If Jack and Diane have the most exquisite of lawns, the most appropriate practice for my wife and I is not to go picnic on their lawn. It's to do the work in our own. It's to do the hard work this spring, to fill in the ruts, to reseed the places that are bare, to weed and feed it so that the weeds get destroyed and the grubs get killed and the moles move on somewhere else, right? Like I should do the work on my property. If your marriage is suffering, if someone else seems to be more interested in you than your spouse, or seems to be more interested in your spouse than you are, you have a problem. And it's time to address it. And Solomon would say it's time to water our own lawns. Our marriages are threatened on multiple fronts, friends. It's time that we begin defending them on multiple fronts. Mark 12:30 says, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. We are mind, body, and soul. God desires that we love him with our whole being. Your marriage is meant to reflect your relationship with the Lord. Your spouse deserves all of you. Mind, body, and soul, emotionally, socially, relationally, physically, spiritually. Are you investing in your marriage? Are you giving to your spouse at a more intimate level in each of these areas than anyone else on the planet? Strong marriages are built, mind, body, and soul. Your wives should be getting more time and attention and information than anyone else in your life. Your husband should be getting more transparency, thought, desire, and self than anyone in your life. If you're withholding from your spouse and giving to another something which is meant to be most for them, we need to start being honest with ourselves. I share more information with my best friend than I do with my husband. I share more time with my buddies or with my coworkers. I talk more about my frustrations with them than I do with my wife in the evenings. We need to prioritize the only person you've made sacred, holy vows with. No one else in your life has been offered those promises. And if you're not keeping those promises for your spouse, you certainly shouldn't be fulfilling them with others. Invest in intimacy. Love completely and fully. Guard against others taking what only belongs to your husbands or your wives. Be acutely aware, Solomon would say, of the threats that exist around you. Run from those hazards that are threatening to distract and divide you. And invest fully in the nurturing, in the care, and the love of your spouse. These protections over time wash away that which is caustic, that which will eat away, that which will destroy the very relationship you've invested so heavily into. And pray that the Lord would give you the strength and the awareness to know what's happening day in and day out. God, we thank you for marriage. We thank you for the beautiful institution that it is, for the partnership that exists between a husband and a wife, for the intimacy that we share with one person. God, we know that you have created marriage for our benefit. You've created marriage that we might show another more closely the love that you have lavished on us than any other. And so, God, I pray today for those who are struggling in their relationships with their husbands or their wives. God, would you light in us a passion for the one that we've made vows with? God, would you make our egos small enough to begin to heal from past hurts? Would you give us the intestinal fortitude to invest again into that relationship, to do what we've promised unconditionally for them? And for those who are not yet married, Lord, who are still watching and waiting for that day to come, Help us to remember what marriage truly is. A way to reflect your love, a way to fulfill your purposes in this world. Help us to be aware of what type of person will help us fulfill that life mission. To not be distracted by glitz and glamour, wittiness, but to see real character, to be drawn to those who love you and want to honor you as well. And then, God, help us to practice and to protect the one that we have fallen in love with. God, would you strengthen marriages in this space, that you might be honored and that we might be blessed. Amen.